Writing is by far one of the best ways to improve your memory. It's one of those activities that exercises nearly every level of memory you can imagine and provides a powerful dose of meaningful spaced repetition. And because writing offers your mind a whole lot more than just spaced repetition of core ideas, interesting vocabulary and terminology, you might even think of writing as mnestic memory, or the memory of memory itself. After all, where do you look when you're trying to remember something? Back when I was a kid, it was either the encyclopedia or the dictionary, but now you can use writing to search online versions of those marvelous devices. In fact, that's what search is. It is writing into the search engine. Now, one of the great thinkers in our time about writing is David Perell, who also touches a fair amount on memory in his work. And he has some interesting things to say about spaced repetition, with more things on the topic to come in his own writing. But not only that, David's an online educator who has been making the most of what current technology has to offer. And he does this by not only teaching people how to write, but how to think about all the things that writing can be. Now for me, writing has always been the ultimate form of spaced repetition, and although it's never natural, writing is one of the most unnatural things you can do, as is language itself. Except for the fact that, it's been produced by evolution, which may be why it's the most natural thing of all things. But when it comes down to sitting down and composing something, this is not necessarily something that nature cooked up. It's something that discipline has helped many, many people do. And in a program called Rite of Passage, David helps people do just that. So to learn more about writing, its ties to education, its ties to memory, and dive deep into this wonderful idea of taking on a rite of passage of your own, welcome to this discussion with David Perell. David, thanks so much for joining me on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. This is a really fun thing because I've been following what you're doing for a long time, and to be able to connect and speak is always a privilege and an honor, and to share forward some of these ideas with others. So thank you.
Thank you for hosting me.
Well, I wanted to start really with the notion of learning in public, and what is learning in your mind, and what is the public?
Yeah, for me, I think learning is, I guess, a couple things. A process of satiating your curiosities and a process of getting what you want in the world. So I'll sort of take both of those. As humans, we are very curious creatures. One of the things that you can A/B test as a writer is that if you withhold information, you are going to get many more responses from people who are leaning in, who are saying, tell me, tell me, tell me. And so as humans, I think of the experience of communication often like music, where if you just give people information, just like giving in electronic music a bass drop, it's not nearly as satisfying as if you give people a setup like electronic music and then you give them the bass drop. And that setup comes from creating a gap between where the person, all the information that the person knows is available and what you're actually giving them. So that's the first aspect of learning, satiating your curiosities. And that's endless. It just goes on and on and on, which makes a learner's life so much fun. And then the second is just getting what you want out of life, making more money, having friends who you enjoy being around, doing work that matters to you, having meaningful relationships with families. All of us have so many freaking problems. And and learning is sort of a process of systematically eliminating those problems. So on the downside, we're not dealing with pain and suffering that we all face. And then on the upside, sort of ascending up the ladder of human thriving. And I think learning is somewhere in the synthesis of those two things.
Right. Well, that's super interesting. It sounds simple, this construct between pleasure and pain, or the, solving of problems to move away from pain and so forth, but it's actually tremendously nuanced at the same time. But just to pick up on something, when you say public, you mean hoi polloi, or are you doing this for very specific people?
Yeah. So then there's learning in public. So it is, once again, those same sorts of things, but now we add in the public element. And what that is basically curing intellectual loneliness, I think, is one of the main things. And what I mean by that is when I started writing, the reason why I got into it, I grew up in San Francisco and I went to college in a small town in North Carolina. And I was going to school there. I was at a university and I just felt like there was something in me. Maybe it was from being raised in a city. I got this bug of intellectual curiosity and I couldn't satiate it with a lot of the people around me. It was killer. It hurt. It was one of those things where I just wanted to talk to my friends about the ideas that I was learning about on the internet. They were cool. They were exciting. They were vivacious. They were filled with vitality. And I would sit at home and watch YouTube lectures, read articles, and I'd be like, wow, ideas are so cool. And I would just go down the rabbit hole and I'd show up to hang out with friends and they weren't interested in those ideas. And now this wasn't a problem about these other people. It was that I was into these niche interests, and in geographic space, when you live in a town with 6,000 people, there's just not that many people who are going to be into, say, something like the way that technology companies are using network effects to aggregate influence and to build sustainable business models over time. Like if I'm that interested in that, it's just hard to find people when I'm walking on the street who are also interested in that. So I'm like, okay, I have this intellectual loneliness that a lot of people face,
Right.
but I didn't realize that till later. I thought it was just me. So what I did was I started sharing ideas on the internet, and I started tweeting and publishing blog posts, all these sorts of things. And I realized that the internet is this amazing matching tool. And it's always been like the first 20 years of the internet is basically us just taking advantage of low-hanging fruit with matching. eBay starts off with people selling Pez dispensers, people buying Pez dispensers. Airbnb, I have a house that is empty and you want to stay in a house, say for the weekend or something. The internet is really good at this. But what wasn't really taken advantage of until this whole learning in public movement was doing this for ideas, of basically putting ideas out into the world like you with memory, and then attracting all these other people who are obsessed with memory and being able to take advantage of the global scale of the internet and the fact that it's an incredible matching tool.
Right, right. Oh, that's super interesting. I'm glad you went that way, because one of the things all of these observations could be absolutely wrong, but it seems to me that a difference between what you're doing and what I'm doing is that I almost feel in that sense of matching that I'm, doing this keyword writing and research, whereas I watch you and it's it's almost eclectic. I mean, it has its focus. There's no two ways about it. But, your subject lines will always have these three things that are sort of divergent from one another. And then I see all this stuff it's linked to itself and it links very nicely, but it also seems almost like, how does Google know what you're doing? And so I wonder myself, have I somehow, misunderstood Google or something like this? Because I always feel like I'm training robots to, craft a particular vision of memory. And then I just wonder, you have such a diversity of things, like how that matching is working, and how you think about, writing as a collaboration with search. Now that you've mentioned matching, that sort of is a spontaneous question that comes to mind.
Yeah, the best way to model me is I'm basically a preschooler who never grew out of that mentality of just going all over the place and just like trying to have fun like a little kid. But somehow I developed a liking to things that other people think are serious and useful. That's honestly the best way to think about it. So I try to never take anything so seriously that I lose the joy from it. And I think that in anything that you're doing, enjoying the thing is more important past a certain level than optimizing that thing. So that's often true. So what I never want to have, especially in these individual pursuits, it's different with my company, but in my personal pursuits, I never want to get to a place where I've so optimized the thing that it's just not fun anymore, because then I'm never going to do it. So to speak to exactly what you said, the reason why I don't focus on SEO and stuff is it's just kind of boring to me. And I am somebody who leads with interest, leads with curiosity, leads with my emotion, my energy. What am I feeling today? I'm just that preschooler who's just like, what do I feel like doing today? And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go write about that thing. And that's why I'm sort of all over the place.
Right. Well, yeah, don't mean to insinuate that it's all over the place, but the diversity of interest, I think, is quite interesting.
Well, the thing is, to your point, you can basically, there's a spectrum here. And one of my students came up with this, where in terms of having interests, and I'm not making a value judgment here, you can either be an architect or you can be an archaeologist.
Right.
And an architect basically starts off and they say, okay, let me get pen and paper and let me just architect where I'm going to go. So I'm going to get the Google rankings and I'm going to get all the keyword search. I'm going to look for where there's opportunities in terms of high search volume, but then not that much competition for that word. And then I'm basically going to decide very tactically what I'm going to write about, what I'm going to think about. And there are so many people who have crushed it with that strategy. On the flip side, there's archaeologists. Archaeologists are just like, I'm just sort of following my intuition for what's interesting, what could be useful. And I know that if I just keep following that, just a little bell of interestingness, and I'm just sort of always listening. Okay, it's like when you're a kid, there's a game of hot and cold. And the whole game, it's so fun when you're a kid, is hotter, colder, and someone hides something. And then you're just always sort of trying to figure out where that thing is. And I think of it like that, where I'm much more of this digger archaeologist. I'm just sort of trying to find my way through. And then eventually I ended up with this thing where, oh, that's interesting. I'm actually really interested in learning, in becoming a citizen of the internet, and in writing, and in the synthesis of those three. So now what I do is I just sort of explore whatever, and then I apply a filter of those three things on it. And I quite enjoy it, but it took me 5 years to get there.
Right. Well, that's super interesting. I have, John Morrow.
No.
He is a really great writer, and he's been my mentor for a couple of years. And he told me one time, he said, your problem is you're trying to be two people. And this thing that you just said about the archaeologist and the architect, that I think is what I've been trying to do as a writer, is to try to satisfy humans and robots at the same time. So when I, see this alternative learning in public sort of people, it is so interesting because they're still doing it, still sort of making it. But I think of the robots as the great memory that binds us all, sort of thing. So I love that. And I wonder, do you think there's a way to fuse those two, archaeologist and architect? Couldn't you be the archaeologist who says, okay, now I understand the pyramid, so I'm going to build one?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I started, I was happily unoptimized. At certain times, when I need to get something done, I'll be a little bit more of an architect and I'll decide something. But you know what I usually do? I usually build systems from the bottom up and I just let them grow organically. And then I step back and I say, okay, what is organically emerging and how do I add structure to this? I do that all the time. I mean, that's like my teaching. It's basically, I figured stuff out for years in terms of the art of writing online. And then when it comes to my students, when it comes to actually building a curriculum, I just looked at what had I already done and how do I put words, principles, and structure around this thing so that that idea can then can move from my mind to the student's mind. So I do think that they can be synthesized, and the way in which they come together, I think, depends on the mind of the individual.
Right. Well, that's useful. Let's talk about Rite of Passage. I mean, that is one of the reasons I wanted to reach out long before, but the thing that really prompted me is we have a student in common, and I had met with him on a call because he's in one of my more exclusive back-end sort of programs. And he said that, I should be talking to you, not just as such, but also because he wants me to do something like what you're doing with Rite of Passage in terms of doing cohort because of this kind of connection. And he was in tears talking about the impact of your program. So,
Wow.
Rite of Passage is obviously a kind of play on words at some level, but what is it all about, and how did you come to create this? Like, cohort has been this word that sort of has exploded lately with the online thing. I'm an old university professor from quote unquote back in the day. Not that I'm that old, but cohort is not this new word for me, and I'm just kind of what are the challenges? What's happening with this notion of online cohort, and how did it come to be?
I think that basically what happened was in 2017, I took a course called Building a Second Brain by Tiago Forte, and it was just game changing, life changing in every way. I mean, I had horrible writer's block. I had no way to manage the abundance of information in my life, and Tiago helped me do that. And I took the course. I obsessed over the course. I read every single book that had influenced Tiago, including a book called The Principles of Product Development Flow, which is actually a book about manufacturing that he applied to knowledge management. And I read The Goal, which is about the theory of constraints. I mean, I just went all over the place. And I called Tiago about a year and a half after taking the course. And I said, hey, you taught us how to capture, organize, and distill information. I want to make a course about how to express information, how to express yourself. And so that's what we did. We flew down to Mexico City, where he was living at the time. We spent 10 days putting a curriculum together. And I said, hey, Tiago, I want to build exactly what you've built, of a live course that is now called a cohort-based course. And let's do it together. Let's figure it out. And it ended up working. It ended up being this huge market that not a lot of people were focused on, not a lot of people were teaching about, which is really just this art of writing online. And look, there's been many waves of online writing, but I think Twitter and just the ease of building and growing email lists relative to where it was when I first started doing it in 2014 has created this explosion of interest. And then also just in terms of creator monetization, in terms of them to monetize through courses, that has really been enabled by Zoom. So there's a lot of technological shifts that have come together to make what's happening right now a pretty transformative moment.
Right. Well, what is it that transforms people? I mean, what is it that brings the tears to the eyes of this? Is it the tech coming together, or is it you?
I mean, I'll tell you what it's not. And this is a pretty hard thing to accept as a teacher. I'm not sure it's my ideas. And I think that the role of a teacher is changing. I think that I used to think of myself as a teacher as somebody who just delivers information. I have idea. You must learn idea. Once you learn idea, you will succeed. And I just don't think that pedagogy is all that useful. The way that I've changed how I think about my role is really being an instructional designer. And so basically, what happens with Rite of Passage, this is like the keys to the castle. So what happens with Rite of Passage is people come in and they're like, I need to learn the method and the technique. And everyone comes in with the mind. And they're like, give me the information. Cool. I'll give you the information. I'll tell you exactly what to do. So I tell them what to do. And they're like, whoa, hold on here. I could learn everything, but I won't actually improve as a writer until I start getting to the other two parts of my being, which is the emotional component and the nervous system. And those comprise identity. So basically, we start off and we're talking about technique. And then what we've done is we've designed an experience for people who over time begin to think about, how do I deal with my emotions? So we have mentor groups, and they function to take this big course of hundreds of students. This cohort, we have 305 students from 33 countries. And then you work with individual mentor groups. And this is a place where you can talk about things that stir your soul, dive into sort of the whims of your heart and what you're feeling emotionally. And to have these deep one-on-one conversations, and then to understand what's sort of happening in your body. Why do you feel imposter syndrome? Why do you feel anxious before you publish them? What is stopping you besides just the technique? That's what you came for. Then what happens is you have all these people who are doing that, hundreds of people who are having these open conversations, who are both pushing each other to raise expectations, helping each other succeed, saying, yeah, go publish, make yourself a better writer. That's what we're here for. But then also being able to open up about who we are, what we struggle with, who we want to be in this world, and we dive into the depths of identity. And then we end up rising back up into technique, but with the support, the weight, the scaffolding of the emotions and these conversations. And you end up with being somebody who can now step onto the internet, step into the arena. And that ultimately is what the Rite of Passage is all about.
Right. Well, it's very, very interesting. And that does seem to me like, this is not going to be pre-recorded videos to get that kind of, outcome. So writing to me seems to be such a different thing these days, in many, many different ways. There's, dual path readership in the first place. So you're kind of, writing, content, and then you're writing this sort of meta content that's driving people through things. But that's online. I mean, it's sort of different in books, and books always had that anyway. They had section headings and chapters and all that sort of stuff. But to what extent are you an online reader versus an offline reader, and how does that fuel and shape the way that you write and think about teaching writing?
Yeah, I'll sort of latch on to the last part of that question, which is, how do you think about teaching writing? What is fundamentally different about the way that you see things? And there's really three ideas. They're all fairly simple, but the implications of these ideas are quite profound. The first is that you should write from abundance. The second is that you should write from conversation. And the third is that you should write in public. And all of these were things that I discovered that I never learned in school, and I wish I'd known earlier. So writing from abundance is basically this idea that when you sit down to write, you shouldn't just be staring at a blank page. Start with an abundance of notes and get to a place where you're passively collecting notes over time. Because think about it. When you're reading something, what are the chances that when you're reading something, it will be the point in your life that you'll need that piece of information the most? I mean, never. And the thing that you realize when it happened to me this morning, I'm writing a piece about the shortcomings of lectures, and I went into my notes and I just needed some intellectual support. And I came across a quote from an academic who was writing in the 1950s. I hadn't read this quote in 3 years. And I said, wow, that is the perfect quote for what I need right now. And then you can take advantage of silicon computers, which have perfect memory, and let your mind be for just coming up with ideas and actually think with your computer. That's writing from abundance. The second is writing from conversation. People don't realize, like, conversations are so easy. They're always happening, right? We're doing it right now. And what's great about conversation is you're always structuring ideas, and you can see what people are feeling. Are they confused when you're talking? Are they bored? Are they engaged? And when people are repeatedly engaged, when people repeatedly laugh at a story, that is a signal to go write about that topic, because you've already structured the thing. And
Right.
so you can use your conversations, which are already happening, to just improve your writing so that you're not stuck sitting at a computer being like, how do I frame this thing? No, by the time you sit at your computer, you can already have a lot of ideas structured and formed. And finally, write in public. We spoke about this earlier, but if you actually share your ideas with the world, you take the internet and you have the entire gravity of humanity, the technological gravity of humanity working for you. The way that the world is changing, you basically have, because information, whips at the speed of light 7 times around the globe in a second. And it's basically, you publish something online and you basically just have these little minions who they just listen for calls of who's interested in Anthony or David's ideas. And then they just carry your ideas to any continent, anywhere with an internet connection, and they create serendipity for you, relationships. And so those three together make online writing fundamentally different.
Right, right. There seems to me that there's a connection between this idea of writing in public, learning in public, and just memory. And what I'm thinking of here is, and I don't know because I haven't taught writing for a long time, but when I did, there was only one course where I ever required people to have a blog, and that was because we were learning about the history of the internet, which, crazy as that is, already in 2006 there was a university course on the history of the internet. But whatever, they needed to write and have a blog and do that in public and so forth. But so many people, even though it was a requirement, they had almost no courage to put their stuff up onto the internet. And I think memory is the same thing. So I teach, what I would call hard mnemonics. Like, you use this to memorize real fast on the fly, and you either got it back or you didn't, right? And so many people, there's always that public element to it, and they have no courage to fail. But the failure rate, I think, would be almost the same, at least in the beginning, because later, as you practice with memory techniques, you're going to get much, much better. But you might never get better with writing, because if you don't ever have an audience on the internet, so not really coming to a strict question here, but rather a discussion point where it's, this kind of thing of like, how do you get started? And then will you ever have the audience just by putting it out there in order to do that? So there, the risk proposition is a little bit different. The writer would have the fear of rejection because of something they have written that was seen. And then they would have the fear of rejection because it was never seen in the first place, because just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's seen.
Every writer, young writer, has two great fears, and they're totally contradictory. The first is that no one's going to read their stuff. And the second is that everybody's reading their stuff, and they're now the center of everybody's attention, their friends, their family, and everybody in the world, and that they're going to be exposed as an intellectual fraud.
Mm.
You can't have both of those at the same time. Every new writer struggles with both of those. Now, there's solutions to all of these things, which are things that we speak about in Rite of Passage. But I think that fundamentally, you bring up a very good point that, and I think that to your point about why does Rite of Passage make people cry, like your friend, it's because you can't write without drilling into your identity, discovering who you are, what you stand for, what you believe in, what are you insecure about, who do you want to be, what are you interested in. Writing is forced introspection. It's an activity that forces you to pause, to stop, and to listen to yourself. And we're quite afraid to do that. It's not something that is easy to do. The structure and the speed and the flow, the energy of modern media counters all of that. And so, oddly enough, the reason why people struggle to write when they begin doesn't actually have that much to do with writing. It's that writing exposes all of these aspects of ourselves, but that's also what makes it such a worthy enterprise.
Right, right. I read something you wrote where the gist of the argument is that writing is not typing. And
yeah, exactly.
I always find that a bit troubling because, people ask me, how do you write so much and all that sort of stuff? And I say, I don't make it about my mind. I don't make it about anything other than typing. It's just a physical act, period. Forget about what I'm going to write. Just get down there and start to move. Now, I obviously don't take that much farther than that, because once you're into the physical movement, then it's neither one nor the other. But say more about that, because I think it has implications for people who use memory techniques and so forth as well, because there is a kind of movement has a primacy. It may not be prime, but it has a primacy in getting started so that you can establish some sort of flow. Because if it ain't physical, then it ain't happening at some level.
Look, typing is part of writing, but it is by no means much of what writing is. And by that, I just mean that there's so many other things that are involved in the writing process. I mean, you say that you spend a lot of time typing, and as do I, but let me give you a very concrete example. So what I do is say that I write for 90 minutes. My goal is basically to make that 90-minute writing period as much of a output focused thing as possible. When I started writing, my 90-minute period would be a lot of sitting and thinking. And yeah, I could type, but junk would come out.
Mm.
What I've wanted to do, and what I think is a lot more productive, is to basically think of writing as something that extends beyond. I'm writing right now. You're asking me questions, and I'm being forced to articulate, to structure my thoughts, to say, hey, okay, this idea is pretty interesting. This one, I didn't actually say it that well. So even if the general point was there, I need to go over that idea, say it again. Right. But say that I just deliver a hit right now, and I'm like, yes, that is a killer idea. What I will do is I will go and I will sit down at my computer right after, and I'll just write it out. Or I'll use a voice transcription service. I'll go on my phone. It'll auto transcribe. And now what I have is I have ideas on a page, and I have that through conversation. Also, a lot of my life is just collecting interesting experiences, reading interesting books, so that is basically giving me the intellectual food that I can cook with later when I actually type. That's basically me getting my supermarket of groceries that I can go buy and then mix and match later on. And so what I mean when I say writing is not just typing is that I used to think of writing as, okay, I'm going to write, and I'm only going to think about my ideas when I'm sitting down at the computer. But I'm saying, no, writing is not just typing. If you can actually have a process and a way to integrate your writing with your life, because writing is, sort of the playing of ideas and just sort of roaming around. And if you can integrate those two things, then when you do actually have time where you're sitting down at the computer, which of course is absolutely necessary, that time can be so much more productive and enjoyable for you. And you're not going to be sitting there with the dread of the blank white screen being like, what am I going to write about today?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it reminds me of the common sort of saying where somebody says, wow, how long did it take you to write that article?
Exactly.
And the answer is my entire life. I mean, it's just, it sounds cliche, but it is sort of true. I suppose.
Yeah. Well, there's another one too of the one time there was a guy who was locked out of his home, and he calls the locksmith, and the locksmith comes up, looks at the lock, and goes, okay, I need to go think about this. I'll be back in 5 days. And so the locksmith goes away, and then the locksmith comes back, takes 5 seconds and unlocks the door, says, okay, I got it fixed. That'll be $10,000, please. And the person says, wait, that took you 5 seconds for $10,000? Are you kidding me? He goes, no, it took me 5 days to unlock it. It only took me 5 seconds to actually turn the key. Right. And I think that there's something similar there.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that, you remind me of a David Mamet thing where he was talking about how long it takes him to write a play or a screenplay. And he said he'll spend 2 years writing notes. And you had mentioned notes as well as being important, but he'll spend 2 years writing notes and 3 hours writing the play. And, which is the writing and which is the, the idea phase, et cetera, is open. But yeah, that is that sort of similar thing. I just wrote something yesterday, and I thought at the end, I was like, yeah, that took an hour, but that was a lifetime that sort of went into it. So I guess is part of the problem that people have when they're struggling to write is that they're just not, they just don't have that model. They're not driven by the idea, or is it that they see, this is where I get with the typing thing as physical conditioning and training. because as I experienced typing, and I have an unusual, not to go off on an anecdote, but I was punished with typing as a kid. So I was a misbehaving student, and they put me in front of a computer and they said, you're going to sit there for the next 2 hours or whatever until you have time out and whatever. So I was punished with computers and typing, and I learned how to type in grade 4. So part of what I feel happened to me is happening in some way to everybody. It's just a matter of degree, which is that language is forced on us, and our ability to output with language comes from our practice, our physical, actual practice with it. So when people struggle with writing, I usually just say, write your damn name over and over and over again, if that's what it takes. But this is a training process of wrangling with language itself. Haptic memory studies show us that, the more you integrate with hands, the more you're going to actually have a dexterity in terms of expression. It would be the same thing with speaking. So I don't mean to essentialize it or reify it into keyboards. I'm more thinking of that sort of physical thing. So when you talk about learning from interviews, for example, and I'm aware that I'm, extending this and not being the kind of ideal interviewer that you talk about who shuts up and listens, but I'm, trying to extend this to what extent the real struggle, because I think everybody could write incredibly well if they would just actually do writing and as you say, get into that emotional depth so that it can pour out. But I just wonder how you think about that. I mean, golfing would not be much different. You're either actually swinging or you're not. It's so physical to me is what I'm trying to get at. Writing the experience.
Totally. And I feel like what you're trying to say is just like, you have to actually write. And of course that's the case. Of course that's the case. I mean, I write every day. 90 minutes, and that is just a ritual, right? That is who I am. My point is just that isn't the extent of your relationship with writing. Your relationship with writing extends to, okay, here's the story. So what Quentin Tarantino does when he writes is, when he's working on a movie, he'll basically be in the typing phase of writing from like 11 to 4. So like 5 hours or something. And then what he does is, before nighttime, he'll spend like 2 hours by the pool and he'll just sit there and he'll do nothing. Is he writing or is he not writing? Because he says that's when he gets most of his good ideas. Right. That's when he gets the ideas for tomorrow. So what he's doing is he's actually making space in his life where he can let ideas brew. And writers do this all the time with walking. So like when I go out on a walk at 8 p.m. and I got my phone with me to just, capture all these notes and ideas, and then I come home and I just write out a little game plan for tomorrow. Is that walking or is it writing? Is it both? It's kind of fuzzy. And so the thing is, it's like breathing. Typing is the exhale, but all these other things, the inhale, which don't look like somebody sitting at their computer with a keyboard in front of them, the mouse to their right or to the left, where they're actually just trying to put words onto the page. That is just one part of the writing process.
I'm glad you mentioned breathing. I mean, it's part of this is what I wanted to ask you about, because, one thing that crushed my mind in the last couple of years, due to some health things, I had to look into DNA and whatnot. And I found out some things like, for example, I have a high percentage of Ashkenazi, which totally blew my mind. My dad's adopted, so we never knew anything about his background. And that got me thinking, and it maybe with writing and memory, we can talk about this, because it made me almost feel like, as a teacher, that I have nothing at all that can ever be accomplished, because it seems like genetics are much more at the core of things than I thought. And so I wonder too about writing and free will. And, Tarantino is a great sort of example of this, because when you look at that story, that history, we can talk about writing being more than physical and all these sort of dimensions, but where's the role of fate, chance, and not just genetics or anything like that, but actually genetics meeting having gotten a yes at the job at the video store that he must have gotten at some point. That leads to this, that leads to that, that leads to that. And me, I don't know how you feel, but it just crushed me. Like the notion, oh, I'm going to teach some things and we're going to have, we're going to break the 80-20 rule and everybody's going to ask questions when they have them instead of like two people and all that sort of stuff. And it's just like, I haven't got a shred of influence over anything. This is a meat tube. The laws of reality are just, so when we say, well, writers should write every day. And, Margaret Atwood says, well, I don't, sort of thing. It's just like, what are we doing all the time in education, period? And I want to segue into the liberal arts topic because I don't know, my mind is, I'm not depressed about it, but it just seems to me like nothing. Lights on, nobody home. Nobody's in control of this. This is just happening. So I don't know. If you have thoughts
to your point, I'll just speak very directly to the write everyday point. Not every writer should write every day. That's what works for me. And for me, like I think everyone sort of has a certain cadence. I do very well with daily cadences. Like I just have an easier time with just daily habits, and I'm going to stick to those things. Tiago Forte, my business partner, he writes sort of whenever he feels like it. So he'll have these long writing sessions. He'll write for 3 or 4 hours. But really, that point was even, what Tiago's doing is still having conversations, letting ideas sort of structure. And then he'll have his time where he'll go to the page and write. I know a bunch of great writers who they just, they write once a week. And that's just when they do it. And they plan what they're going to write about on, say, Monday, and then they write on Sundays. So I think that then to your point about education and about teaching, every creative system is about giving people the tools and the language that they can then work with to create something for themselves. And I always tell my students, if you're doing exactly what I'm doing, you're not doing it right. But if you're doing your own thing, you're either doing it really well or you're not doing it at all. My ask is that you try to embody the different ideas and you just let them sit with you long enough that you can move past your instinctual, no, doesn't work for me. Stay with the ideas for a little bit longer. But then allow yourself to understand the ideas both intellectually and at a visceral, embodied level. And if you can do that, and then you reject the ideas, and you're building upon them, doing something that works for you, hell yeah. Absolutely. I really want you to do that because then the system is yours. And you understand a system not when you copy that system perfectly, but when you understand what the system is going for well enough that you can apply the principles to you in a way that is in tune with your nature.
Well, let's talk about systems. You mentioned constraint earlier, having read about that and so forth. And what are systems and constraints that help authors, and what's the notion behind that?
Yeah, so the French novelist Gustave Flaubert once said, you want to be regular and orderly in your life so that you can be violent and original in your work. And when it comes to writing, I love that idea because if you can have different systems for writing where when you run into a problem, you sort of have a way out. You write at, for me, specific times. You have different ways of getting ideas out of your mind or collecting ideas. Well, then you're very structured there so that the actual things that move through that system, they can just be wildly original and just all over the place. And what I see is that if I can have that simplicity in one area of the system, I can actually go crazier in other areas of the system and just be like, whatever I want to talk about, I'll just bring it in. For example, I am regular and orderly in my commitment to writing a newsletter every Monday. Monday Musings. I've never missed a Monday. But like you said, it's sort of all over the place, right? So because I'm super regular here, I can be just violent and all over the place in terms of thinking, okay, I have 4 or 5 blocks of coolest things that I learn every week that I want to share, and they're just all over the place. So I can, because I'm structured in one area, just say, what do I feel like doing in another?
Right. So when you don't use particular constraints in writing, like a lipogram or something like that. Yeah.
No, although I mean, I really like playing with constraints. There's a great story from Brian Eno, who sort of is like the father of ambient music. So, but he also was a producer. And when they would get stuck, often what he would do sometimes is he would say, okay, you can only use the left half of the room to make this song. You want to use something on the right? Nope. 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 You got 4 hours. We're going to make something with this side. And what he's doing is basically saying, if you can just constrain something enough to get people away from their preconceptions, what they're used to, you can often unlock a ton of creativity. And it's always just worth having those off the cuff if you need to write something.
Right. Yeah, I'm a big fan of constraint, and I think about it a lot because of essentially what I would think of as a free will issue. I mean, as I was gesturing at, I'm not convinced anymore about free will. But if there is something that, one could will, or an act of will, it would be willingly accepting a constraint. And it seems to me the internet is already a kind of constraint, and sending emails, like the form of email is already its own constraint and so forth. But yeah, the Eno thing is interesting. But speaking of constraint, liberal arts used to place certain constraints in certain ways on people, and I really liked the notion you had in an article about saving the liberal arts. But maybe say a little bit about what is liberal in art, why you think they even use that term.
Well, basically, the liberal arts goes back a long way. And what has bummed me out is this obsession with useful knowledge in contrast to useless knowledge. And this idea that if something doesn't make you money, is going to advance your career, well, it's not worth knowing, and it's definitely not worth studying for a long time. And I get why people feel this way, but the current equilibrium where we've settled as a society is not a good one. What the thing with the liberal arts is I think that they should have a much higher status in society. You could almost think of them even as religion for the non-religious in terms of some of the things that it gives you, in terms of its ability to force you to ask hard questions about who you are, who you want to be, what you want to do on this planet. And the thing with the liberal arts is the knowledge changes slowly, which I think is important. We take for granted the idea that in the post-World War II era, a lot of the things that you learned in college sort of just stuck with you for the entirety of your life. In a world like ours where things change pretty fast, that can't be assumed anymore. And I've always been struck by this question of why is it that so many of the best investors I know studied philosophy in college. It makes no sense at first, but I think that as you dive deeper, you begin to dive into some of the fundamental aspects of what knowledge is, sort of what in the essay we call foundational, fundamental knowledge. And you begin to sort of dive into the laws of social reality. And you can either invest off of theories of human nature that are unique to you, like Peter Thiel and what he learned from Rene Girard, or George Soros, what he learned from Karl Popper. And you can end up in these very heterodox places that are quite original and unique. And the hard part is when you try to quantify these things too tightly and you have too short of a window of return on investment, you end up moving into places where things are very tactical, but they're also topical, and they don't have the depth that studying the liberal arts can give you.
Yeah, I found it a bit paradoxical. So, my agenda is I have a PhD in humanities. I was, in fact, the first Canadian to graduate with the PhD in humanities at York University. They invented the program, and I was the first to finish it. Sadly, though, the 80-20 rule was not far away, because there only 13% of Canadians finished their PhD that year anyway, but who started in my cohort, to use that word. But I just kept wondering the whole time I was reading the article. I read it through twice, which is, what are you and your co-author with that article? What are you afraid of? What's the real fear behind this?
If we don't study the liberal arts.
And if we don't, have guaranteed income for teachers and some of the other topics that arise there. And also, in my question about the fear, don't take this as a criticism, but it seemed to me that, and I'm certainly not a POMO, keyboard warrior, whatever you want to call it, but I don't understand what's Western about the Western canon. I mean, I don't see what needs to be defended about it, because when I reread Oedipus Rex the other day, and I reread it in my mind often, it's the Bhagavad Gita, right? And so, and besides which, ancient Greece would never have been self-considered Western, and there's every reason to lump it in with the East anyway. So I just kept wondering, what is the fear here? What is this? Why would we reify this or that canon based on cardinal ordinance,
Well, I think it's less about a particular canon and more about taking history and philosophy and ideas that aren't immediately useful very seriously. I'm very happy to concede on the curriculum front. I'm not attached to, we should teach this, we should teach that, and sort of like, I think it was Alan Bloom who said, we should really reaffirm the canon in The Closing of the American Mind. My take is more of what I call the never ending now, which is, I remember when I was living in New York one night, I used to host these like parties for all these influencers and stuff. And this was down in Tribeca, where we used to do these things. And I remember one night we got in a cab. It was like one of those SUV cabs. And we went to a comedy club on 21st and 3rd, like 25-minute drive. I was sitting in the back, and every single person in the car was watching Instagram stories and Snapchat stories and reading Twitter threads, scrolling their Facebook. And it hit me that for this car ride, every single person had only consumed things that were produced in the last 24 hours. And I don't think that that's a good equilibrium for society to be at. This obsession with the now, this idea that we need to wake up every single day, somehow the world has changed. We need to crack open a newspaper and say, I need to spend 30 minutes today to stay informed about what's going on right now, given the opportunity cost of what you're not doing, which is understanding, where did we come from? What should we know about? What are the analogous moments in history to our time now? How much of, say, the discourse around COVID came back to, okay, let's deeply study different pandemics in the past, and let's look at where are we going to end up based off what we know. We know that, there's going to be issues with vaccines. There should be issues with all these sorts of things. And I'm not actually interested, when I'm saying this, about COVID and vaccines. It's a meta point to reject that the idea that where we are right now is fundamentally new and novel and totally unprecedented. And yes, there's aspects about this time and place that have that. But I think that there's something very modern about this obsession with the here and now. And part of it is just this idea that when we go on the internet, everything is begging for our attention, and the structure of the internet has a huge reason. I mean, look at the way that a podcast feed is structured. What was released most recently? And compare that more classically to a library. I'm not saying that a library is totally better. I mean, I love the internet. I built my whole career in the internet. It is just a comment about looking at the gravity of information flow and acknowledging that it does have such a recency bias, and seeing the liberal arts as a way to step outside of that and not be so obsessed with what's going to help me make more money in the next month and the next year, and just moving outside of this never ending now.
Yeah, I totally agree, or at least I don't disagree. But I also think there's a counter narrative, and I wonder what your thoughts are on it. Very briefly, I often use the term the eternal now. And when you mention, people like Peter Thiel and so forth, who are much bigger participants than most people in the creation of this eternal now that we're in, I have to wonder, well, hang on a second. What is it that the ant in the ant colony behavior of all humanity is engaged in here? Because isn't this the most logical culmination of what humans have been doing all along? When we started this with pleasure versus pain, right? Aren't we just collaborating precisely to be in the eternal now, to have instant on and constant on awareness? This. So in my self-reflection of all these sorts of things, I love the image of the ride, the philosopher sitting with the Instagram people. I don't like that either. I'm not really playing devil's advocate, but at the same time, I have to acknowledge that if humans are collaborating on one thing, it is this instant escape into now, because that's what the gurus have been teaching all along. It's just that now the computers are forcing it on us, right? And then it's going to be Neuralink that forces it on us. So what else have humans been doing other than collaborating on this moment of the one who's scrolling and totally fixed in the now, as opposed to the philosopher who's just like, well, this reminds me of, or whatever, right? So I almost have, as a discipline, removed criticism of it, because it seems so obvious that is where we're going.
I see where you're going, and I think that you're making a false equivalency between the eternal now and presence. And I think presence is being in the moment. And I think that this is what the great philosophers say. A lot of what Buddhism says is be here now. What I think that this eternal now is doing is saying be there now. And they're very different. What the internet is telling you to do in terms of its never ending now is you constantly need to update and refresh and just run on the hamster, always collecting. You are not enough. You need more. Consume ideas, more information, and as if the next thing that you consume will then be your saving grace, but then tomorrow morning you're going to go need to consume more. What I see in a much more Buddhist sense that I am intuiting that you're alluding to is much more about saying no to that information abundance and being much more intentional. And now I'm imparting sort of my own interpretation of being much more intentional about the things that you do read, the things that you do study, and saying, this is worthy of my attention. I have discerned based off the opportunity cost of all the other things that I could be doing, that this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on it. I'm going to spend time with it. And I am going to drink from that straw so deeply. And I am going to make sure that the things that I put into my mind are nutritious. They're going to last the test of time. And that I am going to be a healthier citizen of the planet because I consume this thing.
Yeah, I see a false equivalence there, although I think I'm reaching more to the collaboration of Musk getting us to the stars and then consciousness escaping the death of the sun and all that sort of stuff. So I didn't put that into my picture, but you're right. There's a core difference there. However, two things. Buddha didn't have the internet. right? And the other thing is how do guys like you and I square the fact that we're producing the snares, we're producing the fish hooks that are precisely, you know, guilty of what we would hope others not do at some level, at some fundamental level.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that that's why when it comes to publishing, you got to say, is is what I'm sharing sort of worthy of other people's consumption, other people's attention? Um, and I think that that's a matter of taste, but I think that that's a very profound question, and it's why as creators we should always try to make sure that we are moving up the stack of worthiness rather than surrendering to the whims of what technology is making us do. And it's always a tricky tension there because we have to feed our families. There's a lot going on. And then also, just speaking from the perspective of my students, there's a lot of people who end up in a place where they're creating things that are absolutely worthy of other people's attention, but their early work isn't all that good. This is like the perpetual startup that goes on to become $1 billion company, but their website looks so bad that it, not even a college intern would have accepted it as something worth publishing. And so the thing is, even as a creator, you need to have a certain patience with yourself to say, you know what? The very first things I'm going to publish, they're not going to be incredible. I'm working towards that. And when you get started, there's always a gap between where you know that you can be and what you're actually publishing. And so as a creator myself, it is my job to answer that question by making sure that the things that I publish are worthy of people's time and attention. That's my job.
Right. Well, that's a beautiful way of thinking about it. That sort of returns me to the saving the liberal arts. I mean, isn't this saving the liberal arts? Again, Peter Thiel, listening to him with Eric Weinstein. I mean, I guess another way to ask the question is, I listened to the Portal or whatever, and now, do I understand what they're talking about, or do I understand what they're talking about because I got a PhD, or, do I not understand it and it's just like, wow, this is blowing my mind because it's now a portal of entry to go look up some other stuff, or is it just an Instagram feed that's just longer and I never actually go and look up all that stuff, but nonetheless, how is that different than the university where 500 people come into the lecture hall? 2 of them are going to maybe go and, follow up on the reading, etc. So that gets back to my question of like, what are we really afraid of in losing the liberal arts? Because just as a last point on this, when we talk about the billionaires and so forth, I mean, doesn't it make sense for a university to cut back on all that stuff when the internet culture is clearly and obviously replacing it? Now, I know that no, you want actual constraint on things and cause people to go through that. But it seems that it's just voluntary that so many people are. I mean, I saw Jordan Peterson pack out a lecture hall in Brisbane that's actually an opera house 2 days in a row. So it's just kind of like, do we really need a university for liberal arts anymore? And I say that as someone who would love for it to continue. So I'm not that sort of thing, but I have to ask the question because aren't we doing liberal university right now?
I see your point, and I just think that there's more to a university. There's more to a really good educational experience than just the ability to access information. And what I saw after I left college and really wanted to learn these ideas on my own, was I saw that it was actually in the discussion groups. It was in the groups of people who, with a forward-leaning posture, said, yeah, I want to soak up these ideas. And I remember we brought on a tutor from Columbia University who would work with us. And we would read Rousseau and we would read Hobbes. And we would only get to meet once a month because it was just hard to get everybody totally together. But I felt that minute for minute, those nights were some of the most beneficial nights that I had in terms of my own learning. Something about the stickiness of memory from those nights, from those conversations, was existed through time for me. And then when I went to audit a class at Columbia, the entire class was focused on the philosopher Max Weber, and having a professor who sat down with me in flesh and blood, he was 6 feet away from me, who used to be the head of the Frankfurt School in Germany and who had spent years studying Weber, and to be in the presence of such an expert and be able to ask him questions and to have the collective energy of people who wanted to be there, who wanted to study these ideas because they knew that they were weighty, they were heavy. To bring all that together was unlike learning on the internet. And two of my best friends in the world came from those experiences. And the problem is, in order to study at Columbia, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Columbia is a magnificent institution, absolutely magnificent. But how can we now use the internet in the same way I've done with writing to allow people to come together to obsess over these ideas in a way that's more rigorous and more affordable? That is what that piece is about. And ultimately, that's one of the things I want to do most on this earth is make it possible for people to engage with these ideas, because social learning, when we're with others, there's something about it, going all the way back to Aristotle and or Socrates and the Socratic method. We've long known that having these conversations aids in learning quite a bit, and the internet hasn't given me that. And so, can I make a very rational argument for why it's different? No, but I know that it is different because I've felt it, and it's something that I so want to exist. And I know that there's thousands of other people who want that to exist too.
Yeah, as do I. It's a shock to me that international travel is still closed, because I was just hoping to do like retreats on memory and meditation, and was ready to shoot out my own emails, and it just all came crashing down, and it hasn't been restored yet. And I totally believe it. And we could probably go into all kinds of scientific reasons why actual presence is so important. And I was blessed. I mean, I did a second MA, and I got to sit with Zizek for 6 weeks. I mean,
wow,
it's very different. It's incredibly different. There's nothing, you can't replace it, So I agree. But you mentioned stickiness of memory, and so maybe by way of coming to a close, you've mentioned lots and lots of names, books, etc. How do you commit things to memory? Do you commit things to memory?
I have a terrible memory. I have an absolutely atrocious memory. The only reason I'm able to make it seem like I do have memory is that I write a lot. I mean, a lot of the things that I've spoken about today, I've already written about, and writing is like spaced repetition for your mind, just in a fundamentally different way. That's the grand irony of this whole thing, that I have a terrible memory. That's why writing from abundance and taking notes and being able to search through my ideas, that's why it was so game changing. That's why I teach it. That's why I had terrible writer's block. And we know that the salience of memory is tied to emotion. And that is just another reason to write about things that stir your soul.
Right. Well, I have a terrible memory too, and that's why I love memory techniques so much. And
right,
writing,
exactly.
writing to me is the ultimate mnemonic, as you've expressed. But you told me you were writing about spaced repetition. So, what's new and interesting to you about it?
Well, here's the thing. Spaced repetition seems to work incredibly well from the studies that I've read. It seems to be very low-hanging fruit in education. So I'm like, why isn't everyone just working with flashcards, opening up Anki, and just embracing the hell out of spaced repetition? And honestly, I think it's just like the simplest base level answer. I just think it's boring. Like, I don't think it's very fun to just write a bunch of flashcards and then review those flashcards. It's hard to get excited about that. And there's just opportunities to make spaced repetition not feel as circular as spaced repetition has to date. And I'm trying to investigate, sort of pair a spaced repetition learner who is actually retaining ideas, likely, just sort of archetypically speaking, with somebody like the 3x on Audible person who's just like shoving information into their brain, just as the more the merry. And I actually don't feel like they retain that much, but there's something that's really fun about it. There's something that's really satiating about just, I'm going to put so much information into my brain, and it just makes you feel like you're learning. It really does. But I'm not sure that it's all that effective. And so the question is, how can we take the empirical research of spaced repetition and apply it in a way that is fun and enjoyable and actually taps into the human thirst for novelty?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting with the 2 times, 3 times speed thing. This is just a hypothesis. I haven't got any research on it or read any research on it, but it seems to me that there are nuances in expression that are really hard to catch at that speed. And I stopped 2 times in content. I mean, the odd time I'll try to get through a video here and there. So still, but overall, I stopped doing it a long time ago. Partly because I noticed I wasn't paying attention to it. I was just listening to, but also it occurred to me that there is nuance of expression in the actual speed as it happened, so to speak. That I think has direct implications for memory. But in that research, the thing that frustrates me the most of pretty much every memory study I've ever seen is they're asking people to remember stuff that they don't care about. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read one in your research so far or in the past, or if you ever see anything, let me know, where they say, okay, we got a group of people who are super passionate about Spanish or whatever, and we gave them some memory techniques, or we gave them spaced repetition software, and then they look at it like the actual role of motivation in any mnemonic technique or strategy. You have any thoughts about the content, the actual thing that's being memorized?
Oh my God, tons. I mean, I just think that teachers should be way more focused on inspiring their students, and motivation is super important. And if you care about what you're learning about, you're going to learn way better.
Right.
These are such simple things, but the posture of someone just sort of sitting back in their chair, trying to stay awake, watching the clock and picking their nose while somebody delivers a lecture. And we think that that's learning. Oh, why? Because, well, yeah, we went through the curriculum, therefore they learned. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But back to your points about free will, how do you make people inspired? That's hard to do. And I will say, though, a lot of my own thinking, my own shifts as an educator myself, is thinking of my lectures more as inspiration, more as storytelling, more as entertainment, kind of galvanizing the mind, sort of awakening the mind to then want to go learn things. Remember, we were talking earlier about creating this curiosity gap, sort of satiating the desire to learn. And when I say entertainment, I'm not talking about amusement. Amusement and entertainment are very different. Entertainment is about something that holds your attention. Amusement is about sitting back, grabbing some popcorn, and watching something worthless and nutritionless. They're very different things. And a lot of times when we critique entertainment, we're actually critiquing amusement. But this is something I'm thinking a lot about, because you're dead bang spot on, that when somebody cares, information is a lot stickier.
Yeah. Well, good that you mentioned amusement versus entertainment. I mean, I think that's why it was Neil Postman. He called it amusing ourselves to death, not entertaining ourselves to death. So,
precisely. That was the exact inspiration for that sentence.
Well, it's incredible what you've done. I write a lot myself. Thanks. So I think maybe the volume strikes me differently than it may strike other people. The diversity strikes me different than it may strike other people. And the quality of actual expression, diction, etc. is really inspiring, and it's rare also. So thank you for, what you do, especially at such volume, because having all those moving parts working together with, care and force of argument and research and all these things coming together is a gift to the larger community. So thank you for speaking with us to learn more about what goes into it and how you think about it and how you're teaching it so others can learn it. And I just really appreciate it.
And likewise, I was very moved when you said that you read the liberal arts essay a couple times, and just the questions that you asked about it. I really appreciate it. I spent almost a year on that thing, and I don't know, no matter how long you do this, you always wonder, are people actually going to read this thing? And I just put a lot of my heart into that, and I know it's not perfect, and these ideas are just really important to me. And so when others read them, and then when other people have doubts and critiques that come from the heart, it's how we move forward as a society. So thank you.
Well, yeah, I've often thought that the criticism is worth a lot more than the praise, because praise is usually fast, hollow, and, entertainment, basically, at the end of the day. So, no, I really do. Now I'm praising, of course, but I do it in the context of I guess being in your field at some level, which is multimedia and there's lots of moving parts. So as a colleague, let's say, I admire it very much and find it edifying and inspiring and educational. So,
well, I hope we get to meet in person sometime. This was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Come to Australia anytime. And if I ever get over there, I'll look you up.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank David for his incredible insights and everything he's doing to help people write better and be better citizens of the world because they're training their minds. Make sure to visit Perell.com and get subscribed to his newsletter, not to mention his YouTube channel and podcast. What about you? Are you writing? If not, never forget that beside your brain, words recorded in liquid or digital ink are the ultimate storage and retrieval device. And even better than that, when combined with mnemonics, writing strengthens the tools you can use to improve your memory. And if it sometimes feels hard or challenging, well then good. Feel honored that you took yourself through your very own rite of passage. After all, you're the only one who can.